I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Marr, Martin Gayford and David Cleaton-Roberts, who are all going to be talking tonight about Gillian, their experience of working with Gillian, of talking to Gillian, and their response to Gillian's work. I'd like to start really by just asking you, when was the first time that you came across Gillian's work? Andrew, maybe start with you.
Well, I guess it was in the very early 1980s at the Royal Academy, where I had ambled into the summer exhibition, as was my wont, still is, and I saw one of the works of that period, which are much more thickly encrusted than the paintings around here, and the motifs have got much rougher edges to them. And it was one of those very, very dark black pictures that she produced several of. And I can just remember being thumped in the stomach. It was like a blow to the solar plexus and the air coming out. And I just thought, wow, though I probably expressed it slightly more profanely. And I have been in love with her work ever since. Its twists and turns notwithstanding.
Thank you. Martin?
Well, I suppose I also probably encountered her work at the Royal Academy. I made a little discovery, actually, about my own history with Gillian while I was researching to write the essay for this book, which was I was thinking about her retrospective at the Royal Academy in, when was it, 97? Yes. And I thought, how can I find out a bit more about that? And I was looking around online, and I found a review which seemed to have some quite interesting, moderately interesting things to say, quite enthusiastic. And I read it, and I thought to myself, well, I wonder who wrote this. And well, you probably guessed that. But I scrolled up to the top, and indeed I'd reviewed it, and completely forgotten having done so, which is something that I think is not so much to do with memory loss as sheer quantity of journalism that one produces. But anyway, that was a moment at which I started writing about her, and after that I found myself intermittently writing more and more. She contributed to a series I did for the Daily Telegraph in which artists chose a painting to talk about. She chose Miro. That was about 2000. I wrote catalogue essays. I interviewed her. That was probably a moment when I started getting drawn in more firmly into Gillian's world. I remember one of the first things she said to me is, I can't speak, but am I managing to? My goodness, yes, she certainly can.
Yeah. Well, I met Gillian, through the gallery, but I remember it was one of the first exhibitions I was here for. We were doing a Gillian Ayres print show, and Gampels were doing a painting show. And I think it was probably the first artist dinner I was ever invited to, organised by Gampels. And I walked into the restaurant, looked where I was sitting, and I was put next to Gillian. I was absolutely terrified. I think I was 24, completely petrified of this legend. And she was completely sweet, and we spent the whole evening talking. And probably since then, I've talked to her almost every day of my life. I talk to her more than my own family. She's the most wonderful person who, although she lives in Devon, Cornwall, she very much feels that she's still a Londoner, and so she wants to feel connected to London, and so she just rings up to find out what's going on. But no, that was the first time I met her properly.
I think what's so great about this book is it really brings across Gillian's personality. Martin, you talk a lot, you quote her a lot, but you do seem to bring across her personality. Can we talk a little bit, before we go on to talking about her work itself, about her personality? Because I think it's just, many of us here have met and talked to Gillian about, the great personality that is Gillian Ayres.
I could jump in. I have also interviewed her, and I have to say, with the greatest love and affection for Gillian, she's one of the worst interviewees you could possibly have, because she talks a bit like, well, if you really listen to her, she knows more about British painting than anyone I have ever met. She has an extraordinary, encyclopedic and very subtle understanding of the whole history of British painting, particularly modern British painting. But she is incredibly self-effacing. And I think, Alan is sitting here, I think her works would be selling at 3 or 4 times what they sell at the moment if she was, like most artists, a very practiced self-publicist and went around talking about how great she was and giving interviews about her extraordinary painting and her philosophy and going to the right parties and oiling up with the right people. But Gillian has never, ever done this. She drinks, she smokes, and above all, she paints. And if you want to understand Gillian, in the end, you have to look at the paintings, because she won't tell you.
That's absolutely true. She'll never talk about what's in them. I mean, I remember asking her quite blatantly once, someone had specifically asked me, they said, is that particular motif a tree? And I said to her, we've got this person who's bought this painting, they've asked it's a tree. And she just looked at me and said, possibly deer. And then just went off on a tangent about Constable cloud studies. And that she's not interested at all in talking about the work. It's just much more about looking and with her.
Well, yes, that is true. I have come across more difficult artists. Balthus, for example, refused to answer any questions at all. She's not very keen on discussing what the paint's doing in any sort of precise way. But I mean, that's very reasonable because it's very, very hard to put into words.
You know all about her, Martin. Therefore, the danger of this kind of thing is you can get these great stories and they'll be disproved because someone will say that's not quite true. But the best Gillian story I knew was that when she was, during the war, she had been at St Paul's Girls' School, and the school was evacuated to Cambridge, and her parents drove her up to this rather bleak building outside Cambridge, and she looked at it, and they looked at it, and the car just carried on round and came back again and said, we're not going to leave you here. As a result of which, she was educated for at least a big chunk of the war in an air raid shelter, a bunker off Richmond Park, with two other girls, one of whom was Shirley Williams, and one of whom was Shirley Conran. And I've always thought, that must be the best bloody air raid shelter in the entire war. Three extraordinary if you see the early interviews with Gillian, she has this very, very piping, very proper, correct voice, but this absolutely blazing self-certainty she's had since the age of 17 about her painting. No self-doubt about the actual work itself at all. Extraordinary courage.
And extraordinary levels of determination, which I think were probably necessary to blast her way into Camberwell School of Art, blast her way into the world of painting, blast her way all the way through. And one notices that. For example, last summer I went down to talk to her and look at some works, and it was Devon, and it was midsummer, so it was raining quite heavily, and a lot of her works were in her studio, and she was very keen that I should see Cumuli, which is a huge painting from 1959 in 2 parts. And the rain sort of, we were waiting to get the train back from Exeter, and the rain was sort of dying down, and so she, although I thought nobody involved really wanted to do this, she got her 2 sons to remove it from the studio with the help of a neighbour who didn't seem to have any sort of excuse for not taking part. And all of us were inveigled into looking at it, and it was, in fact, worth looking at, a wonderful experience. I think she has extraordinary levels of willpower. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, to understand Gillian, I think, is to understand that painting for her is an absolute vocation. It's not something she does, as a pastime or a pleasure. I mean, she'd be painting if she wasn't making a living out of it. It's something she just has to do. Every day of her life, that's all she wants to do. And that's all she's always said that to me, I have to paint. It's not something I have a choice in. Painting is absolutely the core and the essence of what I do. And I think that when you understand that, you understand her work. Because it's this utter self-belief.
Martin, you start your introduction actually by quoting Gillian saying, I just like painting. I wouldn't know what to do without it. I don't find it odd to spend one's whole life painting. I've got my mind on it all the time.
Which is pretty much, she's been doing it since the early 1940s. And actually later on, I quote her saying that at one point she felt she almost couldn't stop. She was driven to paint for hours and hours and hours. She finds that less these days. But the will to paint, the urge to paint.
Can we talk a little bit more about the actual work itself now? Gillian strikes me as an artist who never really stays still. Her styles have changed and developed over the years, from the 50s through to the present day. Even now, they're changing and developing into her late 80s. In this room here, we are sitting with a painting that has never been exhibited before, from 1972, which David and I found rolled up in her studio. It's a fantastic pleasure and privilege to be able to see it today. Opposite a painting, one of her last paintings that she's made that was finished just at the end of last year, with great stylistic differences. Can we talk a little bit about that? how you see those developments.
Yes, that's another of her opening remarks. I was talking to her for a catalogue essay, and her first remark was, "I've changed again. I'm sorry, I have." Yeah, she's changed style about once every 4 or 5 years since the mid-1940s, I would say. And there are actually, one of the things which struck me as a result of this project is that there are areas of her work which are still relatively unknown. These very long pictures from the early 1970s, mid-70s, according to Sam Mundy, there may be up to 20 of them which have, in almost all cases, have never been exhibited. There's one in Cardiff. A few of them were shown at the time, but I think Casmin found that they were too big, really, for his to be shown in his gallery. Also, a lot of sticks and earwigs fell out of them when she unrolled them, when she took them into the gallery, because they were all done in her garden in Barnes. So there's her work is not actually completely known yet, and yes, she's had multiple phases, which are quite hard to locate. We were talking about this earlier on. Where does she fit into wider art history? And that's an interesting question. I mean, it's a tricky question, it seems to me, with British art altogether, that there are almost no real movements, with the possible exception of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. There are loose groupings which usually, when you interrogate the artists who connected with them, the artists say that they don't really think they've got all that much in common with the other people, wherever it is, Euston Road, Camden Town. But Gillian is a maverick in a maverick area. So she's, for example, in the Situation exhibition 1960, which is one of those big landmarks in post-war British art, she says, I think it's correct, she was not only the only woman artist, she was the only non-hard-edge abstract artist, so somehow she got in there, but she didn't fit, and it's always like that.
I would say that Martin knows a lot more about this than I do, but it seems to me that there is probably, with the exception of one short period of her painting in the late 1970s, the things that are consistent about her in all these different periods all the way through, twofold. First of all, she's really, really interested in the material physicality of paint. She loves paint. And at different periods, you see that the way she puts the paint on, the thickness of the brushes. There's a wonderful film of her back painting in the 1980s where she's in an immaculate floral dress and she's got painted nails, and she's just picking up huge gobbets of paint and smearing it on the canvas. A cigarette out of sight. She just loves the stuff. And all the different periods, right from the early 1950s paintings when she's pouring paint on and splashing it, throwing it on the wall and moving it around with a broom and so on, right the way through to the paintings she was making just a few months ago. First of all, she loves paint. And secondly, I would say that another consistent pattern in her work, however it changes, is that she has an almost uncanny and brilliant understanding of how to organise a complicated surface, so that she's balancing motifs and colours with a sort of skill and an understanding that I find completely awe-inspiring. I don't understand how she does it. I look again and again and again. Why did she put that blob there? Why did she choose that particular tone of red? And that is an uncanny skill she's had all the way through, I would suggest, style after style after style. Mm.
Yes, and that's what she finds difficult to put into words, exactly where that blob went there. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. One of her slogans is, it's all about what paint can do, and she seems to be constantly finding different things it can do. So there's a period in the late 70s of the paint being tremendously thick, and other periods where then in the early 80s it gets much looser, and Tim Hilton described that period as the thick and thin period. And so she's finding different things that paint can do, but it's always about certainly the joy of paint.
Is it fair to say that one of the real things about this event is that if you're going to be a serious painter, you have to do at least 2 or 3 things. You have to be able to produce surfaces which are emotionally and intellectually really exciting, and you have to do it in a way that feels of the moment and of the now, and in a way that is your own. And so you're not merely imitating other people. And to do all of those 3 things these days is incredibly difficult. Very few people, it seems to me, have found a way of making really exciting new pictures which are of the moment and entirely personal. And she's one of the very few who I can think of. I mean, along with Howard Hodgkin and a few others. But
yes, although I just a footnote. I'm suspect it never was that easy. Actually,
it was always difficult.
Yes,
yeah.
The past is sort of concertinaed a bit, so the good things stick out. It's.
And of course, she paints very intuitively. I mean, there's no studies, there's no underpainting. I mean, she's standing in front of the canvas, and it's all about, it's a visceral thing. It's all about what's there in front of her. So, and I think that's an incredibly important thing for her as well. It's just a completely natural reaction, paint on canvas, and this love of paint you're talking about. And she has said, I think, in an interview with you, where she can paint for an hour and then stare at the painting for 2 or 3 hours in the studio. You know, it's the looking for her that's just as important as the painting.
Yes, that's an important point, because painting is, after all, people talk about conceptual art, but painting is actually quite a conceptual art, it seems to me, that most practitioners I know spend a lot of time thinking about it. So it's not just a question of putting it on the canvas.
Can we talk a bit more about her studio practice? David, I don't know, or Martin, perhaps you've talked to her about how she makes work, how she plans, what she does, her practice over the year. Does she have
I mean, she said to me that she prefers to make paintings in the summer, and then in the winter she prefers to be in the print studio, partly because it's warmer, and partly because of the light. You know, in the summer she can paint longer, you know, into the evenings, into the nights. The paint dries quicker. But I mean, the interesting thing between the prints and the paintings is that the painting for her is an incredibly solitary practice. I mean, that film you talk about, I think, is the only recording of her actually painting. She's always resisted people filming her paint, and I can completely understand that. But then in the print workshop, she's there with a team of technicians, you know, responding to her direction, you know, working with her. So the 2 practices are very, very different for her.
But she's always made prints.
She's always made prints. She's made prints since the 1950s. She loves printmaking, always has done. She's been frustrated with it at various points in her life, but especially over the last 20 years, she's made as many prints as paintings, definitely.
Can we talk a little bit about these woodcuts, one behind us here? When did she start making these works on paper, these particular...
So the woodcuts started around probably 6 or 7 years ago when the paintings changed. I mean, it's always interesting to me. Alan and I would go down to the studio, and there'd be a kind of a nervous conversation with Gillian, nervous on her part, where she'd say, before you come in, you have to understand my work's changed again. And we'd kind of go, yeah. And she'd go, no, it really has changed. And then we walk in there, and of course, as Martin said, it had changed again. And it was when the painting started to become less about the thick application of paint and about these clearer, more delineated areas of colour, that the carborundum prints she'd be making, which are very heavily textured, very thick, didn't make sense in terms of her painting anymore. And she'd always loved woodcuts, so she decided to try woodcuts. And again, she immediately took to the process. She immediately discovered this wonderful Japanese paper, which adds another layer of texture to it. And so all of a sudden, this whole new body of work came out that we hadn't envisaged, she hadn't predicted would happen. And that's really where the woodcuts came from. And interestingly, she's now used up the entire world's supply of this Japanese paper. In order to do this print project, we had to source it from all over the world. And I think between her and us, we now own the last remaining three rolls of this paper. So,
coming at this question of what she does and how she does it from a different direction. One thing she's never done since Claude Rogers forced her to do it at Camberwell School of Art circa 1948 is sit down in front of an object or a person and work from life. So that helps to locate her in the sort of landscape of painting methods. She doesn't work from an object. She doesn't work. She's never worked from a landscape, for example. Although some of her works, especially I think in the late 50s, are very imbued with landscape. So that brings us round to this difficult word, abstract, which I think is rather unsatisfactory, actually. Her other teacher, one of her other teachers, Victor Passmore, once told me that he preferred independent as a word for what he did, independent painting. And so Gillian, one would roughly categorise as abstract, but actually at various phases, for example, right now, there are visible objects, stars, in her leaves, plants, flowers, in some of her work, but they're not done by sitting down in front of the motif. They somehow get into the work. And personally, I suspect, for example, that vegetation may result from the fact that her studio opens directly onto a rather beautiful garden, which then there's a sort of wilder area going extending down to the border with Cornwall, and she just walks through that and sees it. So there's a sort of natural process of what's in your mind that comes out on the canvas.
Martin, would you agree, however, that, was it Patrick Heron who said, I hate all symbols and I love all motifs, and that in a sense what she is doing is using shapes so simple and deliberately, crudely drawn that you're not supposed to really think, oh yes, that's a whatever. In other words, they're there to hold the colour in and to make the right mark or the right assessment or shape on the part of the canvas she needs, without you thinking at any point that there's been a piece of foliage there or that she's talking about real stars. In other words, it's just enough of a shape to be a motif, but never a symbol.
Maybe, yeah. When she talked...
Sorry.
Oh, no, you may... When she talked about Miro, she certainly toyed with the idea that his symbolism, birds and so forth,
yes, might
have some personal significance for him. But if those stars, for example, have a significance for her, she's certainly not telling us.
Well,
so
Miro used to go down to the beach, didn't he, and pick up objects which would then recur in his pictures, he said at one point.
And he certainly had a sort of personal symbolism of
yes,
this and that, which I think she probably doesn't really have. What do you think, Dave?
No, I mean certain motifs kind of appear and then run through particular series, but I think you're right. I mean, it's like, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the influence of Wales on her work because of the show in Cardiff, and she says, I used to walk in Wales all the time. I've always loved the landscape, but I've never painted a landscape. I've never painted a picture called A View from Cadair Idris, and yet there's a group of paintings which are very much a response to that time spent walking in the Welsh mountains. And so I think for her, I mean, I consider her to be, a pure abstract artist, unlike someone like Howard Hodgkin, who, talked in terms of abstraction reflecting emotion or times and places. For Gillian, I think it's a much more purer thing, the abstraction.
I feel they're both located somewhere close to a rather vague frontier there. So Howard Hodgkin said something to me about the magic of when a paint mark just turns into something. So Rembrandt makes a mark and it just turns into a woman's leg in a picture in the National Gallery, and he could do that occasionally, and I think that kind of thing is going on a bit in Gillian's work. She's talked to me about how she'd just pour a lot of terps over those late 50s pictures, and she wasn't painting mist, but she knew that the terps would dilute the paint and it would act like mist, so the paint just has the same physical character as the landscape. So she's not depicting it, but there's an analogy there.
I think also people often ask us about the titles, because with Howard the title is very important to the work. With Gillian, the titling is always done afterwards, and not always by her. And people are slightly misled by Gillian's titles because often she, recently a lot of the titles allude to Italian gardens or flowers or particularly kind of romantic poetry. But the paintings aren't about those things. They take on something after their title, but
Yeah, but she accepts the titles, doesn't she? She's not calling them Untitled 5364. she's calling them Antony and Cleopatra, or Prometheus, or Dowland's Book of Ayers, and that. The fact she accepts those titles, even if some of them weren't thought of by her, in fact, suggests that's a general sort of emotional area she'd like us to be in when we're looking at her picture.
But I think that's the thing. It's the area is what's important. It's the emotional and intellectual response. I mean, if you look at that picture here that we've got in front of us, those of us who are sitting up on the podium anyway, it seems to me that gives me a lot of the excitement of a very complicated, blazingly colourful garden or outdoor experience. But it's not that. It's not looking like it. It's giving you the same emotional charge. And that's the important thing. She's looking for the emotional charge. And as I say again, in a very, very clever way, she's been able to hold together a large number of motifs and colours, which in almost anybody else's hands would become chaos. And with her, it's never quite chaos. She just pulls it back right at the last minute again and again and again.
Can I ask you a little bit more about her influences? We've talked about landscape and you've touched on Miro. Are there any other obvious influences that you think we should discuss in terms of Gillian's painting?
Yes, although another of Gillian's remarks to me is that critics and historians always go straight for influence, and she never knows what to say to them, because actually everything you see influences you. I'm sure that's true. You know, she's been looking at exhibitions and going around the London galleries since the early 1940s, and every single thing she's seen, and going on these walks in Wales and visiting the Mediterranean, visiting India, all these things will have an impact. But I think it's important that, it strikes me as important, that early 19th century, late 18th century English art is important. Her Turner Constable, James Ward's Goodale's Scar, she mentions, that seems to be related to that painting called Distillation, which I think is a masterpiece, actually, which is in the Tate collection, one of her early, you might call them abstract expressionist paintings. Who else does she mention? Everyone who uses paint in a really juicy way, Titian, Rubens, Matisse. I think these are important markers of where she... I said in Cardiff, we talked about Michelangelo. She slightly struggled to be interested in Michelangelo, although she was having a go.
Well, Martin knows much, much more about this than I do, but I would say the three crucial influences are Matisse, Matisse, and Matisse.
Thank you, Andrew. David, anything to add?
No, I mean, I think, my conversations are very similar to yours. She's a voracious, looker. She's always looked at art. She just loves looking at art. But, we've talked about Goodale's Scar and Constable cloud studies, things like that she loves. And she told me a wonderful story of when she was very young, visiting Windsor Castle without an appointment, turning up with Jim, her son, and just banging on the door and being let in to look at the drawings collection by Anthony Blunt. And just being allowed to sit there in a room on her own, unsupervised, looking through Leonardo drawings.
Yes.
And it's memories like that which have stayed with her and have been completely inspirational, I think, as well.
Yes, well, she told me about Casmin arranged for her and Frank Stella to go to Berlin at some stage. This was before the war came down, to look at the Pergamon Museum, and for some reason Casmin decided that they ought to see this. And so off they went, and she found that very interesting, but the difference was, which is possibly says something about their two approaches, that Frank Stella saw it very quickly and disappeared, and Gillian lingered for hours and hours and hours and had to be turned out by the staff. Just a footnote to what you were saying about Matisse, that she remembered that probably in about 1948, William Coldstream at Camberwell said to her, Matisse can pass me by. And Gillian, who was then 18, said, well, he's bloody well not going to pass me, which is certainly turned out to be the case.
What about travel? because we talked about the Welsh landscape. Obviously, she lives in the west of England now. She has travelled. How has that influenced her work?
Oh, a huge amount, I think. I mean, she loves travel. I mean, she's always travelled. She considered it one of life's great luxuries to travel. I mean, she was at the British School in Rome. She travelled extensively in India when her show toured there. I mean, it's always been a great love of hers. And wherever she travels, the work changes in response to the travelling, I think.
Yes, what she's never felt much like doing is lying on a beach, however. Which is actually, when we were talking about determination, industriousness is another quality. But I think the visit to India, which was, 1990, had a visible effect on painting. So these tremendously yellow paintings filled with the sun appeared, and she told me that the floral motif, which was all over her work about 5-10 years ago, appeared after she'd visited North Africa, the Middle East, I think Yemen and Egypt. So things sort of filter through.
She reminds me a little bit of Bridget Riley in that regard, in that the influence isn't sort of direct. What happens is the colour register changes where she's away, when she's been away, and you can see that. That's absolutely right.
Can you talk a little bit about why you think she's drawn to live in these rather remote parts of the British Isles?
Keep away from events like this.
Yes. I'm not sure, because I think there's a slight conflict there within her. I mean, as I say, she considers herself a Londoner at heart, and yet she's always, well, for the last 30 or 40 years, she's chosen to live in very remote landscapes. I mean, in Wales on the Clyne Peninsula, and then north. I mean, anyone who visited her down in Devon knows that it's fairly remote where she lives. So I'm not really sure. I mean, I think it's a lot to do with landscape. She responds. She doesn't like being confined. She doesn't like small spaces. I mean, she told the story about when she was younger, having a job working in a basement in Marks and Spencer's, and she hated it. She just had to get out, get on a train, and go to Cornwall. So I think ultimately she feels most creative when she's in or close to an open natural environment, and that's not not like a city park. It's more a genuinely natural environment like Wales or Devon.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think it's she's not alone in feeling both sort of centripetal and whatever the opposite is. Centrifugal force. So that she's the St Ives painters tended to be very frequently on the express train from St Earth back to London. So London is one pole, and some remote spot is another. But Gillian, being a maverick within a Mavericks, didn't very much fancy St Ives, so she's found another spot with wild cliffs and the sea and a remote landscape.
I think if you're able to go and live somewhere like that and do what you love in that kind of place, you'd be absolutely mad not to. And I think, if you're a successful enough artist, so you can make your work in the centre of one of the most beautiful parts of the UK, miles from anywhere, and live for that work, and yet be able to see it, in central galleries and admired in big collections, then you have got it made. Perfect.
Wouldn't suit everyone. I was reading the other day about Francis Bacon's feelings about the countryside.
He had other interests.
Well, he felt the countryside was an area of horror. Those creatures shrieking in the garden. So everyone's different.
Yeah. I want to bring up the subject of Gillian being a woman, and because we've had long conversations with her about being labelled a woman artist, and actually being a mother as well, and how do you think she, coped by, bringing up a family?
All I say is woe betide the journalist who asks her the question, what's it like being a woman painter? She will bite your head off and tell you very clearly that she is a painter.
Yes.
It's nothing to do with gender. She is a painter first and foremost. And I think she feels that very strongly. But she also says, I've always been a feminist. But first and foremost, it's not about me being a woman or a mother. It's about painting, and actually always comes back to that point. It's always about painting. But
Well, yes, that's absolutely correct. It's also true that she must have required all her resources of determination and willpower to force herself into it, because, becoming a painter is not very easy for anyone of any gender, and becoming a painter for a young woman in the mid-1940s, 50s must have been tremendously difficult. A lot of discouragement. She actually remembers being discouraged by various people who told her she'd have to teach needlework or something, and she just says, I was always very ratty whenever there was anything like that, remarks like that made, so she obviously just ignored that and did what she wanted to do.
Yeah, I'm very interested about that. When I was sort of first getting interested in painting as a boy, and you look through books and books of great painters, there were virtually no female figures at all. And as soon as women are brought into the art colleges in large numbers, they not only thrive but tend to dominate. And I think if you look, one of the interesting things about British painting, British art at the moment, if you look at the crucial figures, how many of them are women. And all it goes to show is once you remove the blockages, there is no gender difference at all. But Bridget O'Reilly, Prunella Clough, you think of Claire Wood at the moment, and many, many other people. In a sense, I would say that British painting at the moment is dominated by women. And so therefore, far from being the odd one out, maybe she was a trailblazer, but I think you're absolutely right. She would not enjoy this part of the conversation. We could probably move briskly on.
But it is historically true that she was the one woman artist in situation. I think the one woman artist in metavisual, abstract, Tashist, the Bradford Gallery in 1957 and so forth. So she was quite isolated. There's a wonderful photograph in the book, I think, of her sitting in the Walmsley Arms, a pub in Camberwell, where an exhibition of student art had been organised in 1948, and she is the only woman in the room, surrounded by a lot of young men wearing velvet jackets.
Would she have felt isolated? Because she always looks supremely self-confident and relaxed in those photographs. I'm not sure, even at that stage, whether she's thinking, I'm the only woman here, or I'm a painter among painters.
Oh no, she looks, in that photograph, she's sitting in the middle of the group, cigarette in hand, looking completely confident and at home. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think she would have felt out of place.
And the other thing we should say about her, of course, is that I've spoken to lots of people who've been taught by her. I think she was the first female professor of painting in Britain, and also one of the most successful teachers. She was a much loved and very, very successful teacher for a long period of time. And that gave her a kind of a location, I guess, down in the West Country and in Wales. So.
Did she enjoy teaching, David?
Yes, no, she was a passionate teacher. She believed in it very much, at St Martin's and at Winchester. And ultimately the reason she stopped painting was because, teaching was because she wanted to paint again. And she felt that probably you couldn't do both full time. But no, she loved teaching. I think
Did she talk to you about teaching at all, Martin?
Yes, well, I think she felt she'd done enough of it by whenever it was 1981, and she gave up. I met a couple of her pupils actually at the Cardiff opening who underlined her enthusiasm for paint. How she would come in and tell them to be bold and confident with their paint, and then possibly sit down on their palette accidentally. And so
I was saying to one as we came in. I've got a friend who's a painter, and he was saying he'd been taught by her, and he'd been really struggling because another of his teachers had said something which I think is by and large true. He said, "Now listen, Adrian, very important thing, if you can't paint big." And this is so sort of frozen him that he does like to paint big, and he paints very well and big, but he'd said this, and Gillian arrived the next week with this huge long roll of what appeared to be a carpet on her shoulder, and just put it down the floor and unrolled it. It was about 20 foot of it. It was a bit like one of those 20 foot of canvas. Must have been an offcut of something that she had been doing. And said, "There you go, get going." and he's never looked back. And it's just the most generous gesture.
Well, a lot of her former students have come to this exhibition as well, actually, which always goes to show if you have people coming back. People right back from when she was at Corsham, people have been coming in. and saying, "Oh, she taught me at Corsham," or "She taught me at Winchester," or so she obviously was a good teacher.
She's very generous about other artists' work as well. I mean, she always takes notice of the other artists, the younger artists we show her, and we talk a lot about, especially the abstract artists. She takes great interest in what artists are doing now and younger. I mean, she doesn't always like it, but she takes a lot of interest in it. Which I think shows a lot of her, her teaching background.
She's obviously a great propagandist for painting as a medium.
Yes.
Apparently other members of the faculty of St Martin's in the early 70s would warn students not to listen to her on the grounds that it should turn them into painters.
I'm going to open it up to the floor now for any questions. As we're recording this, I might repeat your question, so please excuse me. How old is she? She's 87.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Yes?
Has Gillian said very much to your panel about where the images come from, particularly the images in the woodcuts? And, do they start with one shape that leads to another one, or one image that leads to another one, or are they conceived as whole pieces?
Has Gillian talked about how she composes the pictures in terms of what does one shape lead to another, or do you look at the composition as a whole?
Well, with the woodcuts, they start off as an acrylic on paper study. So you'll see just round there's a study for one of the woodcuts downstairs. So I think with the woodcut specifically, she sees it as a whole. It's not one shape necessarily leading to another. And those works on paper, she then translates that onto a wooden block, and obviously it feels very different when it's carved out of wood. But she hasn't talked specifically about where these shapes come from. She never does. I mean, she alludes to things, it's like we've been talking about. There's certain influences, but never anything specific. But I think what's interesting is with the woodcuts as well, what we found is that the prints feed into the paintings and vice versa. So as she developed this woodcut practice, certain elements from the woodcut suddenly started to appear in the paintings. And so both practices work together to develop one another, which is very interesting. And for us, it's a very exciting thing when that happens.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You talked about Gillian's visceral relationship with paint. And I'm still trying to understand, so what you just said, how she makes these woodcuts. And are they one sheet of wood?
No, they're done in different ways. So she'll come to the studio with a study which represents the kind of basic composition, and then there's a key plate. So certain basic shapes she carves out of the wood, and then the other elements. So you'll find, so to use this one as an example, certain of these smaller elements are then carved out as separate wooden pieces of wood, and then inked, jigsawed together. So there's multiple printings of each shape. So she's effectively creating a hybrid of almost like a traditional woodcut, which is the wooden block with the image carved into it, and then almost like a jigsaw, where the shapes are jigsawed together, inked up in different colours, and then printed on another layer. And she'll often print multiple layers to create denser areas, maybe one layer to create where she likes the woodcut texture to come through, or the texture of the paper. Sometimes it's wet on wet, sometimes wet on dry, because that gives different effects. And what she really likes about woodcut is it's not a precision type of carving, and so you get these little accidents that happen. Sometimes you might get little areas of the paper left, and she loves that, the fact that part of the process dictates the final image. On this one, she had no idea that this area here was going to become almost offset. That's the result of the wood slightly overlapping, the two plates slightly overlapping. It was a happy accident, and it gives a dimensionality to it that she loves.
Yes.
You mentioned, or you asked about how she felt being a woman artist, but what about the sexism? What about the lack of money, or the inequality of money and fame with regard to women? The great discouragement. The fact that she lives in Devon and doesn't have a place in London is quite awful.
Oh, she has a house in London.
Sorry?
She has a house in London. She just doesn't live in it. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, she at various points in her career, she's been hugely successful and then less fashionable, and I've never talked to her about it in terms of those things. but I don't, you know, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years, she's never expressed any dissatisfaction with the amount of money she's earned, or from a point of view of being a woman painter.
So she's never made comments generally about the inequality of money and fame with regard to women generally?
Not in those terms, no.
Thank you.
Has she ever spoken to you about that, Martin, at all?
Well, one thing actually, the other day we were talking about a book called Private View, which was published in 1965 with photographs. It's sort of anyway, if you don't know it, it's sort of snapshot of the London art world in the mid-60s, with actually very beautiful photographs and text by Brian Roberts and John Russell. And Gillian isn't in that. Her then husband Henry Mundy is, and Gillian said that actually Snowdon was going to photograph the two of them, but with Gillian as Henry's wife rather than as an artist. So in fact Henry appears on his own as a sort of mugshot in that book.
Can I just say that on that subject, that I don't think we can ever underestimate how difficult it was for her, certainly in the early years. I remember her describing what it was like being a mother of two small children and a wife, and actually getting into her studio once the boys had gone to bed. So she would often start painting at 11 o'clock or midnight, and paint through the night, and then take her sons to school the next day. So the fact that she doesn't make a big thing of it doesn't mean that it wasn't a big thing in her life, and I hope it's working about that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the floor?
I'm just going to ask something, because when you were talking about the influences, I've often thought about her work in relation to American art of the same period. When you were talking about influences, apart from the mention of Frank Stella, that wasn't mentioned. But when I think about the work, within a context, I almost instinctively imagine it within an American context, because it is so daring, it is so uninhibited. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Well, Gillian, after various goes at answering the question, was she influenced by Jackson Pollock, rang me up and said, yes, I was influenced by Jackson Pollock. So I think Pollock and abstract expressionism generally was important. Hans Hofmann was important to her in the mid-70s. She seems to have had what you might call her second career. She seems to almost come to a conclusion in the mid-70s, and then suddenly starts again with tremendous energy. And that one of the triggers for that seems to have been seeing a Hofmann show in the States in, I think, 76.
Right.
So I think, yes, American and probably French painting was quite important to her. She was looking at things in Paris regularly in the 50s.
Would that have been
Tachis, Soulage, yes, I would think.
Because I tend to think of English abstraction as relatively inhibited by comparison with American abstraction, and yet you would never describe her.
That's not a word you'd apply to Gillian.
No.
Yes, well, she looks to me as the freest and boldest of those British painters from in the late 50s. If you haven't seen it, the Hampstead School mural is an absolutely wonderful thing. So huge and very beautiful and very original, and not like anything else in British art. Actually, not very much like anything in American art at that time. But it's got the scale and the ambition of the big American pictures.
And that's hanging in Cardiff at the moment.
She obviously sort of fell in love with Highland at one point. Rubbed shoulders with him.
Certainly rubbed shoulders. They were both in the Situation exhibition. And yeah, on parallel tracks, I would think, yes.
Yeah, the mention of Hoffman. I mean, the biggest influence on John, I know, was Hoffman. Indeed, I think he curated the Hans Hoffman exhibition, didn't he, when it was...
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
What about the movement from acrylic, well, Rippling to acrylic and then oil? What about that? Why did that happen? Do you know?
Well, I suppose that I'm not enough of a paint technician. The Rippling, I would have thought, had disadvantages. She asked for it for the Hampstead mural apparently because she knew that Picasso used it. So she asked for supplies.
Sidney Nolan too was using it.
Another person we haven't mentioned is Maurice Lewis, who was there was a big show about 1960-61 in London, and after that you start seeing, seems to me, sort of veils in some of her pictures, and paint, instead of being flung around, it's sort of oozing into the canvas. So perhaps you couldn't do that with Rippling.
Was it more a question that the American artist opened up possibilities rather than being directly influenced by them?
I think a sense of scale and ambition. Yes. I mean, it seems to me somebody like Helen Frankenthaler or Collins, Joan Collins and others, are answering the same kind of questions, and even Twombly, as she is answering them, but she's answering them in a completely different way.
Yeah.
She says she was very affected by the idea of the canvas as an arena to act in, which is an idea. It's not a very British idea, that actually, but it's an idea that rather than a sort of a visual influence.
And also one other little question. I think I'm right in saying that, Andrew, you're the only one who paints regularly.
I do. That's true.
What can you put into words what you in your practice were able to get from Gillian?
They're mostly Anglo-Saxon words, Alan, because you go, I mean, I was thinking particularly of the Cardiff exhibition, and you see what she achieved year by year by year, and you think, why the F did the rest of us bother to paint at all, frankly. But what I get from it, where I'm trying to be influenced by her, is in the complex way that she organises her surface, and the sense, what she seems to me to bring again and again and again, is a kind of wild, almost demonic energy to the painting, and going at it with great fury and gusto, and yet at the back of her head there is a cold, calculating intelligence working out exactly the balances and the forms, and they all balance and they're all thought through, and the colours, however wildly slapped on, are all very carefully thought through. It's the sheer painting intelligence that I don't think anybody else gives.
And is that a frustration or an inspiration?
Huge. Well, it's both. It's both. I mean, I have done bits of pictures, which are not quite as good as the worst things that Gillian Ayres has done on a really, really bad day. And if I live to be 80 and I do one thing that's almost as good as a bad Gillian Ayres, I will die a happy man.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes.
I just wanted to ask on that point about these prints that are here. Is she now at this sort of senior age, she working collaboratively with master printmakers or?
Yes, absolutely, yes. I mean, generally the history of print is the history of collaboration. I mean, I think many of the best print, artists who make prints work with master printers, and Gillian's no exception. I mean, as the years have gone and the relationship has changed, when she was making the carborundum etching, she was completely hands-on. I mean, she would paint the paper first, she would do a lot of the printing herself, inking up the plates herself. I mean, it was almost, the printer was there almost as an assistant to her. And now, especially with the woodcuts, where a lot of the carving of the blocks is very physical, the dynamic has slightly changed. And so she works very much with 2 or 3 specialist woodcutters to make these prints. So yes, it's definitely collaborative.
And does she feel different by that? We talked about her passion for painting and her passion for paint and slapping it on. And
She's very interesting to talk about it because, I mean, I imagine it must be very hard to work collaboratively with someone like her. And there's, it's just a question of, she's found a a print studio for the woodcuts, and particularly one or two of the printers who work there who just get what she wants. And they understand when she talks to them about particular colourways, what colours go next to each other, how the transparency of ink on paper, the tones, and they just get it naturally. And I remember speaking to Jack Shirov, who used to print her Corundum, who would say, you know, I'm not an artist. I'm just another hand for the artist to use. And that's what how these printers feel. They're just there to help her realise what she wants to.
She really loves these woodcuts. I mean, I've been taking them down to her in Cornwall to sign, and she looks at them for a long time. You know, each one, it takes a long time to do the signing because she's really looking at them, and she's saying, God, they're, you know, she's so pleased with them. She looks at the colour, she looks at how, you know, as David said, the transparency of the ink, things that have happened. You know, she really looks, in the same way she probably looks at her paintings when she's making them, she really, really looks at these prints. And it's been really interesting to watch even that kind of end process of her kind of looking at them, approving them and signing them off in the last few months. It's been really interesting. So I would say that, you know, she's very pleased with them. I think if she wasn't pleased with them, we wouldn't be publishing them, and she wouldn't be signing them.
No.
Yeah.
I'm just intrigued by the process when you said they were all jigsawed together, the different colours have been put onto the different sections, and then they're put together.
So the
Single plate now.
No, in fact, there is. I took a little film in the print studio because it's quite hard to explain. But so the key plate will have certain key shapes on it, and each of those might be a different colour, but they can be inked up at the same time and printed as the first layer. But then, because her compositions are so complex with so many colours, traditionally in printmaking you would do one plate per colour. But I mean, it would be impossible because I mean you'd have to have 50 different wood blocks. So they developed this practice where each shape is, there's almost like a matrix, and they cut out, the shapes are cut out, inked up in all the individual colours, and then locked back together. And so it's built over, I mean, actually one of the most complex ones is the smallest one downstairs, but a single woodcut can be made up of 6 or 7 different plates, but each of those plates will be comprised of different shapes jigsawed together. And that way, several colours can be printed at once, but, you know, in terms of the tonal range as well. So certain areas she might want to print twice, so those have to be a particular printing as opposed to areas which need to be printed once. So it's quite complex, but you know, after an edition is finished, we, as a print publisher, we take the printing plates back and cancel them. Well, a Gillian Ayres wood block is just a bag of bits of wood, and you can never put them back together. I mean, they're lovely things, but you know, once they're done, it's not just a bag of bits. It shows one of these prints going through the second pull. So the key plate has already been printed. Then what you see is the second layer, and actually, as it's being pulled off the press, one of the little shapes kind of sticks to the paper because the ink is so thick and has to be gently peeled off.
Yes.
So is the next book going to be a catalogue raisonné of Gillian's prints?
David, over to you.
Well, the problem with that is that pre-1980 there was little or no documentation on her prints, and it's a wonderful job for someone, not me, who has a lot of time to dig around and find all those very early prints. I mean, she made prints since almost the 50s. I mean, she was going to Hammersmith School of Art, you know, doing these wonderful, but they weren't editions. She was just making them without thinking about selling them. So she would sometimes do one pull, sometimes a couple of impressions, and these things just aren't around anymore. So I'd love to do a catalogue raisonné of her prints, but you know, maybe when I retire.
And beyond prints, there are huge quantities of works on paper which are very little known. There are a few in this exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, these works on paper are fascinating. Helen and I found this painting in her studio, and at that point we hadn't seen any of these works on paper which are contemporary with this painting. And then her son Sam happened to mention that he'd found a group of drawings and he'd put them under her bed, because at the time all the drawings she made just got sold straight away, and she kept none for herself. So this amazing folder of drawings came out with these wonderful, I mean, they're amazing things, and they relate directly to this painting, the painting in Wales. There's some more downstairs. And they'd never been seen before either.
So you partially answered what I was going to ask, actually. Somebody said that the woodcuts now influence the paintings rather than paintings influencing print. And I wonder what the prints were like when she was, say, doing paintings like that in the 70s. And has the relationship between painting and prints changed?
To my knowledge, there's no real prints from this period. She's gone through various periods of completely stopping making prints, and I don't think I've never seen any prints that directly relate to this early 70s period, so I don't think there are any.
But she has changed techniques to suit her painting style changes.
Absolutely.
So as you said, with the woodcuts and these flatter paintings, with the carborundum before, that was...
So if you look at the carborundum prints from 10, 15 years ago, the paper is so thickly embossed, if you turn it over on the other side, it's almost, the plates are so thickly laden with carborundum, they're almost pushing through the paper. Whereas these, she hand painted them as well. And I asked her when she started making woodcuts, are you going to be hand painting these? And she looked at me aghast and said, well, no, there's no need to. I mean, everything's there that I need on the printing block. Whereas with the carborundum print, she felt she needed that extra handwork to give them that quality.
Can I just follow up and ask a question on this, rather than being on the panel, as it were? Because I wonder whether, using the Chinese paper, that affects... There's a great luminescence to the recent paintings, including the four in the new ones in the gallery here. They're just brighter and more luminescent, and I wonder whether the experience of working on that Japanese paper has then fed back to where she's painting.
Oh, quite possibly. I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, especially when we take when the prints are when you hold them up and you literally get light shining through them. I mean, they just radiate light, and I think that must inform some of these new paintings, definitely. I think it was you suggested we try and show one backlit.
Oh yeah, when we were signing them, the sun was shining through the window, and we held up one of the prints, and it's like a stained glass window. Yeah. It was absolutely stunning. It's the next project.
Yes, I was just thinking stained glass.
They would be wonderful. Any other questions? No? Well, I might just finish there then. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, David. I'm just going to remind you that the book is available for sale. Very pleased. I want to thank everybody who was involved in the book. We've got Andrew Brown here tonight, the publisher, who I'm going to plug again, who's selling the book. We've got Tim Harvey, who's the wonderful book designer who made the book, here tonight. Thank you, Tim. And all the staff here have been really involved. A lot of people have been really involved in the production and helped with the research of this book. So we're really thrilled, and most importantly, Gillian is absolutely thrilled with this book. So thank you very much for coming. Have a look at the show, and come and talk to us if you need to. Ask any questions. Thank you very much. Thanks.